Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Tracy Chandler from Dr. Wellness. Welcome to Health Mastery. This is Module 2, Why do we get symptoms and what is the reason for the chronic disease epidemic and poor health? So let's have a look about what we're going to talk about today. So the outline is we're going to go through an introduction, look at nutritional stressors, environmental stressors, and then psychological, psychosocial, and psychospiritual stressors, all reasons for why we have poor health. So just an introduction, a bit of a reminder about why we get symptoms. Now we think that we look like the person on the left, we're made up of different organs, which we are, but in reality we're made up of functional areas, which is illustrated by this biochemical pathway picture here. It's incredibly complex. You definitely don't need to remember anything in this picture apart from maybe the cute photo that my 7-year-old drew for me. And I know we've gone through this before, but it's so important that I hammer this home, that we are made up of interconnected, like a web of pathways. And if one part of this biochemical pathways go wrong, then it has impacts on all the other parts of the pathway. So for example, if we have issues with the hormone part of our pathways, that impacts on our brain chemical part of the pathways, plus many other parts, and then the converse is true as well. So it's really important that we address you as a whole, holistically, and look at all these biochemical pathways together. So this is a great analogy. Again, I know we've talked about this before, but it's just so important. And the reason why we're getting symptoms and not having optimal health is because of that conventional approach, or that traditional approach of, thinking of a dead leaf as a symptom, just cutting off that dead leaf. And if you did that to a plant or a tree, it's certainly not going to grow very well. We really need to get into the roots and the soil, and that's the same when it comes to dealing with our health. We need to look at the roots and the soil. Or another analogy, think about that warning light in your car dashboard. If we just keep taking out the warning lights by giving tablets for symptoms, and not dealing with what's underneath the hood, looking at your whole engine, for one of a, looking at analogies, then we're not going to have a perfectly running car or perfectly running body. And last analogy, thinking about your iceberg, if we just keep taking the top of the iceberg off and not dealing with the iceberg underneath, we're not going to get long-lasting health. So let's look at the first reason for why we have poor health, and this is all to do with nutrition. Now, I know that most of us don't go around eating huge amounts of these foods. If you're here, you're generally eating probably a pretty healthy diet already, although we all have our vices. And for me, I have pudding once a week. I'm human. I would never expect you to completely stop these foods, but just think about trying to reduce them down. And the reasons being is because of all the colorings and flavorings and MSG and gluten and dairy, which I'll go into more detail, but let's take things back a step. If you look at this amazing cartoon by Dan Berger, he's talking about our food's supply chain, and going back even a step further from this cartoon and thinking about how our food is grown. The nutrition in the soil, the nutrients are certainly a lot less than they were even 20 years ago. And so their foods aren't able to take up nutrients because they're just not in the soil. And then the foods are usually, genetically modified. The strains, if you use wheat as an example, they're selected the strains to be really high yielding and fast growing, but they're quite nutritionally poor compared to the ancient grains. And then they're harvested too soon before they're fully ripe. If you look at the tomato example, as an example, and then they're irradiated and fumigated and not stored correctly, and that takes all the nutrition out of the food, so they're not as nutritionally dense as they once were, or they're meant to be, and not that they look like this blob of food in the top right cartoon, but certainly they're very nutritionally deficient, and they don't look or taste very nice, and so they have to put flavorings and colorings and things like MSG and preservatives, because they, to maximize profits, you have to put preservatives in so that they stay on the shelves for as long as possible. And all these things are really bad for our health, and no wonder we're sick like that bottom cartoon. So, looking into this in a little bit more detail, this photo here is such a great example of how processed foods, especially heavily processed foods like noodles, for example, can really, really impact our health. So these photos were taken with a pill cam. So it's basically a very small camera, looks like a pill, people swallow it, and then it can track what's happening inside their intestinal tract. If you look at the photo on the left, you can see a little bit of the pink bowel lining at the back. The white things are heavily processed noodles, kind of like the pot noodles you'd find in most supermarkets. On the right, you can see the bowel at the back and the middle, just like on the left. But these are homemade noodles, so not heavily processed at all, just using all very natural ingredients. And the bowel is able to digest, this is after 20 minutes, able to digest the noodles down into its little units, whereas on the left, the bowel's thinking, I have no idea what this is, I don't know what to do with it, so I can't digest it. It's basically what that photo is showing. Great example of what processed foods do to us. I love this slide. So many of us, including me, have felt the compulsion to completely devour something as yummy looking as this. However, the addictive ingredients in this particular food, the yummy chocolate cake, is also found in a lot of deceptive foods, meaning, deceptively appearing to be healthy but not healthy, such as muesli bars and some of the more what are perceived healthier slices, such as scones. If you're watching this, you probably realize that a scone's not particularly healthy, but it's amazing the number of people I see that do think this is healthy, or do think scones are healthy. So the type of ingredients in here that are addictive, and as I say, in a lot of foods that seem to be healthy but aren't, including so-called healthy cereals, are things like MSG. You'd be amazed. I remember when I first got into this thinking MSG is something you only find in something like Chinese takeaway. But no, you can find it in the chocolate cake. You can find it in a muesli bar. You can find it in so-called healthy cereal. It may not be labeled as MSG. It might be an MSG-like compound, such as what's known as natural flavoring, which is not natural. Or even if it is sourced from natural flavorings, is something that can turn into MSG-like compounds in most people. Other addictive ingredients in this would be gluten and dairy. Yes, gluten and dairy are addictive, and that's because they release morphine-like molecules in the gut. And then, of course, we want to eat more of them, and that's why it's so hard to get off those foods, because they contain those addictive ingredients. And MSG, it not only is addictive, it also is a bit of a toxin for our nerve cells. So that's just a few of the things found in this cake. And then another thing that's found in this and a lot of foods would be even so-called healthy nut milks, which is why you've got to be quite careful of the brand of nut milk that you get. I'll talk more about that in the nutrition module. But emulsifiers, basically, they break down fats, and so they make foods really nice and smooth, which people seem to want. They don't want the lumps. But the problem with that is they also break down the fats in our gut lining, and that can lead to increased gut permeability, which can trigger off the immune system to react to things that it shouldn't react to, including our bodies. So emulsifiers also should be avoided. And then on the next slide, you'll see it's very easy to be deceived by healthy foods, because a lot of them will have health star ratings. Now, these are designed by the food companies for the food companies. So this one here is for Milo. Now, Milo is a malted hot chocolate drink, and it has 4 stars out of 5 on a 5-star rating, which, as I say, is put out by the food companies for the food companies. And yet Milo has an excessive amount of sugar, around about 3 teaspoons of sugar per serving, depending on how many scoops of the Milo that you put in. And when you consider that we should only be having about 3 to 5 teaspoons of added sugar per day, that's a significant portion of our daily recommended intake. So that's something to avoid, is the health star ratings. The best way to know whether or not our food is healthy is to look at the label, which I'll be talking more about in Nutrition 4. Module 4, which is about nutrition. Now, even something as simple as oils have to be careful in terms of how we store them and which particular oils we use. So a lot of oils are just stored in the cupboard in a clear container like the one that this lady's holding, or they're stored in daylight. Both heat and light can what's called oxidize fats or oils, and what that means is that the oils become damaging. And that's before they even get into the frying pan. If you put them in the frying pan, of course, that process speeds up and is more intense in terms of how many oxidized fat and oil particles there are in that product. So when it comes to cooking, the best fats to cook with would be coconut oil, butter, or ghee, because they can tolerate the high heats, unlike olive oil, for example, which is a very common oil that people cook with. It just cannot tolerate the high heats. And then how we cook our foods as well, not just considering the oil, but the actual process of cooking our foods can create damaging particles. So for example, barbecuing can make, not just barbecuing, but frying and grilling too, can make foods go quite brown. And the browner it is, the more carcinogenic compounds it contains. So trying to bake, steam, that's the best way of cooking food so that they don't brown. Or if you have to grill or barbecue, then try not to brown them too much, and certainly don't blacken them. If they do become black, either throw them away or scrape the black particles off. But generally, if they've gone black, it means the whole product's been heated really too high to be fully safe. I have in the workbook put a link to a blog that I wrote on how to barbecue safely for those that do like to barbecue, me included, and how to do that safely. And then how we store our foods is something to consider as well, because most plastic containers contain BPA, which is a dangerous chemical that can cause health problems in our body. The food companies and the plastic storage companies are quite clever. They've come up with this marketing ploy which is called BPA-free products, and unfortunately BPA-free products generally contain BPS, which is a very similar chemical to BPA and just as harmful. So don't be fooled by the hype and avoid BPA-free or even non-BPA-free products. And the best thing really is just use stainless steel or glass. If you have to use plastic, use it for cold foods. Don't heat in it, and certainly don't put hot foods in it, because that's where you get more leakage of the chemicals into the foods. Obviously, having foods that are non-organic and are heavily sprayed with chemicals is going to be harmful for our health as well. And as I say, Module 4, which is the nutrition one, I'll explain about where to find information on the safest foods to eat in organic if you can't afford or can't get access to organic foods. It's really important. So for example, an organic lemon contains about 20,000 sylvestral points, which is a marker of its antioxidant status, whereas a non-organic lemon contains about 20 sylvestral points, so about 1,000 times less antioxidant power in a non-organic compared to an organic lemon. So really important we try and avoid chemicals. Now, it's not just chemicals on our food that we have to avoid, it's obviously chemicals in the air, in the water. Those are both really important factors. Now, most of us aren't living next to a power factory or chemical producing factory such as this, but it does pay to be aware of how close you live to roads, how well you ventilate your house, are you wearing shoes in the house and tracking in chemicals, heavy metals, mold, pesticides. So trying to think about where all your possible sources of chemicals are in the environment, meaning the air and the water. And when you do think about that, also think about how much time you're spending in healthy environments, such as in nature. Now, the Japanese are onto this. They know that exposure to nature is really beneficial for us. And in fact, they have clinics in Japan where all they do is take people out into nature. And it's so effective at improving people's health that a lot of the insurance policies in Japan will cover people going to these clinics where all that happens is they're taken out into nature. So have a think about how much time you're spending in nature. Obviously, in terms of us being quite time poor, you want to try and combine as many things as once. So exercising in nature is obviously going to give you the nature, and it's going to give you the exercise. And it doesn't have to be a lot, even 10 minutes around the block, and ideally in a leafy suburb would be great, but trying to get some exposure to nature, because not having enough is definitely detrimental to our health. So let's move on to the next slide. And then how we package not only our food, but how we package our people. For example, one of the most common sources of chemicals in terms of packaging our people is fire retardant materials, often found in children's pajamas. So, I mean, we need pajamas for our children, and it's hard to avoid the fire retardant chemicals in them, but when you get them, washing them at least 5 times, or at least even once, will make a big difference. And then packaging our home. So, there's the obvious packages in terms of, bedding and linen, but also, carpets as well. The artificial fat materials in carpets can be really toxic in terms of them off-gassing those chemicals into our homes, especially with modern homes being so well sealed these days. Those gases, those toxic chemicals cannot get out of our houses. So try to ventilate your home as much as possible. And then, thinking about paints that you use, not using oil-based paints, looking for water-based paints. And then this is a major problem. There was a study that showed that the average woman leaving a house leaves the house with around about 250 chemicals. And that's by about 9 o'clock in the morning, let alone what she does later on in the day. So, thinking about what you're putting onto your skin is really important too, and trying to go as natural as possible. You've probably heard of parabens and things like phthalates. They can be really toxic for our health. There's some good studies showing the impacts they have on our health. And then sleep, that's part of an environmental stressor. This looks like a very comfortable bed. She looks like she's deeply asleep, but she won't be having a very restful sleep because there's so much light exposure there. It looks like she's got a sound system there as well, whether that's playing music. So, light and sound can be a real problem for our sleep. And so thinking about your sleeping environment. And again, on my blog, I've got sleep hygiene tips. And then too little exercise, but also this photo is relevant for too much exercise. So a lot of athletes I work with, and I'm at risk of this too, are what's known as active couch potatoes, where they do their 1 or 2 hours of exercise a day, or even 30 minutes, and then they spend the rest of the day sitting down at a desk. That's why I have a standing desk, because of that risk of long periods of sitting in one place, which again is as bad as for our health as not exercising, and even negates some of the benefits of exercising depending on how much you're doing. So quick tip, trying to snack on exercise rather than snack on popcorn. Even just standing up for 1 minute every hour can make a big difference. And then avoiding things that we're allergic to, because things that we're allergic to, and that can be the usual things such as pollen or pet hair, but also food and people. We cannot be allergic to people, and so sometimes we can't avoid some people if they're part of our family. But I will teach you later on in the environmental stressor management how to deal with those people, but certainly thinking about the things that we're allergic to or intolerant of. And then poor health. I mean, obviously, if we have a disease, we usually have symptoms, but having a disease can lead to more poor health and more symptoms. So trying to manage those illnesses, ideally by seeing a functional medicine practitioner such as myself, but really getting to the root cause of all those symptoms is really, really important. And then dental issues as well. I mean, this is a great photo to show you kids if they don't want to brush their teeth, and it's really obvious that someone's not going to be very healthy if they've got this type of dental issue. But you'd be amazed. I've seen and heard of so many patients who have no dental symptoms and yet can have their health turned around by having their oral hygiene sorted out really perfectly. I'll give you an example of that. I have a colleague whose patient was in his 40s. He had rheumatoid arthritis. He could barely get from his bed to his toilet. And being a previous athlete, that was obviously incredibly traumatic for him. Now, he managed to get to the point where he could walk by seeing my functional medicine colleague, but being a previous athlete, he wanted to be able to get back to his usual activities. Very ambitious guy, and good on him. So my functional medicine practitioner referred him to a functional dentist, which is kind of like us. They look at things in more depth. And bearing in mind, this patient had absolutely no symptoms, nothing, and nothing obvious when you looked in his mouth. However, the integrative or functional dentist did full panoramic x-rays as opposed to the standard x-rays that most dentists did, and he found under a root canal. Root canals are dead tooth, and why I'm not a big fan of them. Doesn't mean you should rip them all out, but certainly you want to have a proper functional dentist assessment of your root canals and other artificial implants in your mouth. Because this guy had a tiny little infection that wasn't deemed important enough by his usual dentist to have dealt with because it was so tiny, but the functional dentist took out the root canal, cleared out all the infection, and now this patient is running and biking. So you can see how dentistry and getting the right type of dentistry and optimizing your oral health can make a big difference to your health, just with that one example. And then we look at light and sound pollution. We saw that lady in bed earlier. She had some light and sound pollution. But also, during the day, when we're not sleeping, we can have light and sound pollution. And it doesn't have to come from a big city like this one, but also can come from, say, for example, your teenager playing loud music that you don't like, or too little light and not getting any sun exposure during the day. For example, I remember in England going to work in the dark, coming home in the dark, and being in rooms with no natural daylight during the day. That's a form of light pollution. The other thing that this picture symbolizes is the electromagnetic frequency, radiation pollution as well, which there will be a lot in a big city. But also, thinking about our devices as well, there's certainly some data linking brain cancers with cellular device use. I'll give you some tips on electromagnetic frequency or EMFs in a future module, but just being aware of, where is all that radiation coming from. And then medications as well, they can be a source of poor health. Now, I'm not anti-medication at all. That is very important and very appropriate that we have use of medications when need be. But most of even my traditional conventional colleagues will agree that there is an overprescribing epidemic, or polypharmacy epidemic, where people are really on way too many medications. And this picture shows the amount of medications that most average conventional medicine patients are on. And usually around about half of them offer side effects of the initial medications. I'll give you an example. I've seen people on osteoporosis medication because of being on the proton pump inhibitor like Losec, which caused the osteoporosis, and they're on the proton pump inhibitor because of being on anti-inflammatories for pain. Rather than having the pain and the root cause of the pain initiated, they would just put on more medications to deal with the side effect of the initial pain relieving medication. So thinking about all your medications and do I really need them? But obviously not just stopping them, making sure that you ask your practitioner to help you come off any medications if possible. So this photo here illustrates a classic example of feelings of overwhelm, which is a great example of a psychological stressor. There are all the other obvious ones, such as a marriage breakup, financial pressures, grief, not having appropriate shelter, for example. These are all examples of those types of stressors. And so really important that we think about all the obligations we have and commitments we have, and is there any way of getting rid of some of those, getting rid of some of these post-it notes like the example in the photo here. And then another classic example of things, psychological stressors that stress my patients out and probably stress you out, is that feeling of loss of control. And that can be something as simple as feeling like we have no control over our health. I have so many patients that come to me and say, oh, I'm probably going to get cancer because my parents had cancer, or I'm probably going to get heart disease because my dad died of a heart attack. My own father is a classic example. He thought he was going to have a heart attack at 52 because his dad died at 52 of a heart attack. That feeling of lack of control over our health is really important. But only about 5 to 10% of diseases are caused by true genetic diseases. Certainly, as I talked about earlier, we can influence our genes, and that depends on genetic variations, meaning copies of genes, but true genetic diseases only account for about 5 to 10% of disease. So we have a lot more control over our genes than we think we do. Another cause of stress is scales. People are really, so many patients are trapped by thinking that they have to be a certain number on a scale. And this is so bad and creates so much psychological stress. So please do this to your scales. Action. So one of the best things you can do for your health. You are not a number. And then mirrors. That's another classic example of a psychological, we could even call it an environmental stressor. There's a condition called body dysmorphic disorder. Now, we all really have varying degrees from virtually none to very severe forms of any type of disorder, including body dysmorphic disorder. But body dysmorphic disorder is basically where we become very obsessed with our appearance, whether it's our face or our height, and that's certainly heightened in this social media generation where there's so many photos of people taking selfies, and it's almost become the new norm, but trying to avoid mirrors as much as possible. And then this is another form of classic common stressor I see so many patients come to me and say, look, I've had all the blood tests and the doctor said they're all completely normal, but are they being interpreted properly? And I'm going to again go into this in more detail in another module, but just very quickly, I've seen a lot of patients who've been told their results are normal when they're on that tipping point between the red and the orange part of this picture. Basically, this picture illustrates a reference range. So when a doctor gets a result, he gets a reference range. And if your result is right at the edge of the orange, meaning right next to the red, it's not optimal. So for functional doctors, we aim for your results to be in the green, the optimal part of the range. So this could be another reason you're feeling sick, is because you're having symptoms and results that are in the orange part of the range ignored. And so I'll go into more detail about what to do about that, but certainly, thinking about your results and asking to get your results and having a look at them and seeing where they sit in those reference ranges. And so I'll give you a case now, just because it illustrates an example of how a patient was told their results were normal, but they certainly weren't feeling or behaving normal. This is a 6-year-old boy who came to me, had anxiety, behavioral and bowel issues. All his local lab tests were normal. That's what he was told. But certainly there were a few in that orange part of the range. And so we started him on the low stress eating plan. We did some environmental changes. We did some simple supplements. He had no behavioral management because he didn't need it. At the 3-month follow-up, nothing was bothering him. He was loving play center. Friends said he was a completely different kid, not clingy as usual, having bowel motions every day, which is an important indicator of health, and his anxiety was much better. So really important not to ignore your symptoms. So, key points. Your health equals the amount of stressors, whether nutritional, environmental, psychological, psychospiritual, your genetic variation, so meaning the SNPs, meaning what types of copies of genes you have, not true genetic diseases, and that's called the science of epigenetics, meaning we can turn off our bad genes and we can turn on our good copies of genes. That's really, really simple to do, really easy to do, which you'll find about in later modules. And there are so many different types of stressors, not the classical psychological. As you've seen, there's nutritional and environmental stressors. This week's tasks are to review your posture once a day, and in your workbook you'll see a picture that illustrates good posture, because posture can make a massive difference to your health, as it's explained in the book. Review your iceberg. Yes, I know you've looked and written down your iceberg, but now you know some of the other types of nutritional, environmental, and psychological stressors that you may not have thought about. Have a look at your iceberg again. See if there's anything you need to add. Ideally, see a functional medicine practitioner for a full iceberg assessment. And so please feel free to contact my team at drwellness.co.nz. There's links in your workbook. And fill out your medical symptoms questionnaire to see how you score. Ideally, you want your score to be less than 20. And if it's not 20, and if it's in the mild, moderate, or severe category, then you definitely need to see a functional medicine practitioner. It doesn't need to be me, but if you do wish to see me, please click the link for not only the medical symptoms questionnaire, but to contact my team at drwellness.co.nz. And this gives you an idea of what the mild, moderate, and severe categories are and where those scores are. Ideally, you want your score to be as low as possible. And if you have any questions, again, please contact my team by clicking the link in the workbook. And really, really love this quote. It's a great one from Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. So just do something really, really simple. For example, instead of using your cell phone when you're on a call up at your ear, putting it on speaker. Really simple step. Or practice your posture. Another really simple step. Don't have to do massive changes to make a difference to your health. Baby steps. Be kind to yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Lastly, thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening. Remember to look through your workbook and to do today's activities. It's been lovely talking to you today. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next module.